Very simple maths lesson for you all here. Real life equals bad, MCU equals good. It's a formula that's worked across 23 movies and over 13 years or so now, and before anybody says the words "The Dark World" at me, that came out the same year as the Miley Cyrus Robin Thicke twerk, and I know which was worse for my eyes. As part of their forthcoming absorption into Disney's multimedia empire, they're soon to premiere the show What If, based on the comic book title of the same name that imagines alternate realities for some of Marvel's most iconic heroes. It'll paint some familiar faces in an entirely new light, but what if the MCU itself had turned out completely different? No franchise of this size manages to go off without a single hitch, and there are countless scenarios that could have resulted in the whole thing turning out vastly different, or at least vastly different from the all-conquering cultural behemoth that we know it as today. My name is Adam Cleary, and these are 10 huge what-ifs that could have changed the MCU forever. Number 10. What if the Inhumans had actually been made? Inhumans holds the unwanted distinction of being the only Marvel Studios project to be announced and given a release date, but was never actually made. And based on how the short-lived TV show turned out, that was probably for the best. Despite future Black Panther scribe Joe Robert Cole handling the script and Vin Diesel being attached as Black Bolt, 2.5 years before the intended November 2018 release date, Inhumans was quietly removed from the schedule, never to be spoken of again. Given that the eventual small screen series was widely panned by critics and fans before getting cancelled after just 8 episodes, Marvel Studios likely dodged a bullet. Looking at how the characters ultimately fared, there was every chance that Inhumans could have bombed and bombed hard, and even set the MCU's expansion back by years. Number 9. What if the Netflix shows became canon? Once Netflix had cancelled their entire slate of Marvel projects, Kevin Feige publicly admitted that none of the previous shows were considered canon. This means that the Defenders will inevitably be rebooted at some point in the future, but if Marvel had embraced them as part of the shared continuity instead, they would have had a handful of ready-made shows with a built-in fan base at their disposal. Iron Fist might have been not great with a capital N and a capital G, and the Defenders miniseries a bit of a letdown, but viewership numbers and the general critical consensus proved that Charlie Cox as Daredevil, Kristen Ritt as Jessica Jones, Mike Colt as Luke Cage, and Jon Bernthal's Punisher had plenty more to offer. While they might eventually reprise their roles under the new Disney banner, if they'd just been accepted as official canon, then the cast, crew, and creative teams might already have had more adventures. Number 8. What if Edgar Wright directed Ant-Man? Long story short, once upon a time, Edgar Wright wanted to make a Marvel movie, but Marvel didn't want to make an Edgar Wright movie, so they replaced him as the director of Ant-Man with Peyton Reed. The results were very good, just as mentioned, not an Edgar Wright movie. But if Kevin Feige and his team had just bitten the bullet and given Wright free rein over Ant-Man, it could have led to an increase in the amount of authority and imprint that the directors hold over the MCU. The current lack of it has led to a lot of problems behind the scenes and a growing tiredness with the status quo from critics and some fans. Not saying you or me, but some. The Russo brothers are Marvel's favourite filmmakers because they're the best at the in-house style, and with the exception of Thor Ragnarok and Black Panther, the vast majority of these movies could have been made by pretty much anyone. Edgar Wright could have changed that, but they got rid of him. Number 7. What if Robert Downey Jr. left after Iron Man 3? The third installment of Iron Man marked Robert Downey Jr.'s final contractual obligation to the studio. However, his decision to stay on after that drastically influenced both the schedule and the writing of the entire Infinity Saga. The studio even hinted at a Bond-like recasting in 2012, and in interviews around that time, let's just say he looked done with playing a superhero. However, Downey Jr. eventually renegotiated his contract several times over the next few years to become the highest paid supporting player the business had ever seen. Without him, the story would likely have remained the same, with Thanos' plan for the Infinity Stones long since established, but with a less prominent actor in the Iron Man armor, the narrative heft of those movies would likely have been passed to Captain America, which makes that last line sound incredibly cheesy. I am Captain America! Click. Number 6. What if it hadn't been sold to Disney? Now, alright, Disney don't exactly make movies on a small scale. In fact, Ant-Man was the only Marvel Studios movie since Phase 1 that cost less than $150 million to produce. But before they stepped in, it was confirmed in 2010 that 20 to 40 million projects based on Doctor Strange, Kazar, and Luke Cage were in the works. Now, for context, Disney's Doctor Strange cost upwards of $160 million. Even the upcoming slate of shows exclusive to Disney Plus are reported to be costing up to $150 million, which is an eye-watering chunk of change for what will only amount to 6 or 8 episodes of television per season. Before Disney got into the Marvel business, the studio was still keen to expand and diversify their portfolio of comic book adventures. But without those insane sums of money, we'd have had a far more modest, far more varied MCU. Number 5, what if Joss Whedon hadn't jumped ship? Alright, big one. After shepherding the Avengers to widespread critical acclaim and one of the biggest box office hauls in history, Joss Whedon firmly announced himself as the MCU's golden boy. This led to an exclusive 3-year deal with the studio where he held a huge amount of creative influence over Phase 2. Yet despite this, Whedon still walked away after finding himself caving in to the studio's demands more often than he would have liked when making Age of Ultron. Had he stuck around, he'd have had a huge influence over how phases 2 and 3 panned out, meaning plot lines like Thor's Infinity Stone side quest and the Nova Corps' role in galactic affairs likely wouldn't have just been randomly dropped. Not to mention the changing power dynamics between the studio and its assorted directors. Plus, and this is thinking outside of the box slightly, if he had still been wedded to the MCU, there's also the possibility that DC would have had to let Zack Snyder finish Justice League the way he actually wanted to. Number 4, what if Chris Evans turned down Captain America for a 3rd time? In the hands of Christopher Evans, Captain America went from being arguably the least interesting of the Avengers to the beating heart and soul of the entire MCU. Yes, Tony Stark might have been the flashy and impulsive star of the show, but Steve Rogers was the glue that held it all together. Things could have turned out very differently though, had the actor stuck to his guns and turned down the role for a 3rd time. He'd already passed on it twice over concerns about committing to a multi-picture deal and fears about being typecast for the rest of his career. Ryan Philippe, John Krasinski, Sam Worthington, Garrett Hedlund, Chad Michael Murray, Alexander Skarsgård, Kellen Lutz, and Channing Tatum were all on the final shortlist if he'd said no again. But it's almost impossible to imagine anybody but Evans in the role. Without the strength of his performances, the franchise would have been far less character-driven and far more reliant on Iron Man's personal journey. Number 3, what if Edward Norton fulfilled his contract? Well, we wouldn't have Mark Ruffalo, and I mean, what's the point? Yeah, okay, I'll try harder. Edward Norton has always had a reputation for getting involved in the creative process of the movies that he works on, whether the studio wants him to or not. Not being given much of a say in The Incredible Hulk, he walked from his contract as soon as it was finished filming. So displeased were Marvel by all of this that to this day, the bridge has not been mended and only William Hurt's General Ross has survived in the canon. The only way that would have been different is if they'd relented on his demands for input and allowed him to shape the way the character was used in the MCU. This would have elevated the Hulk from the franchise's best supporting character to one of the standalone heavyweights of the franchise. While that feels like a promotion, by taking away Ruffalo's awkward charm, the dynamics of the entire Avengers would have been unbalanced, let's say. And while it is oversimplifying it to just say Ed Norton isn't Mark Ruffalo and that would have been bad, it's also entirely true to just say Ed Norton isn't Mark Ruffalo and that would have been bad. Number 2, what if Sony made The Amazing Spider-Man 3? Jealously watching the success of Marvel Studios, Sony decided to try their own cinematic universe with The Amazing Spider-Man 2, sowing the seeds for multiple sequels and spin-offs. When that flopped, both critically and commercially, they were forced to admit defeat, can their second Spider franchise in 7 years, and let Marvel finally have a go. But The Amazing Spider-Man 3 and The Amazing Spider-Man 4 were supposed to arrive in 2016 and 2018 respectively, with Sinister Six, Venom, Black Cat, Silver Sable, and Spider-Man 2099 all in various stages of development. If they'd stuck the course with this, then there's no Spider-Man in Civil War, no I Don't Feel So Good in Infinity War, and no heroic father figure arc for Tony Stark. We'd have a load more superhero movies, sure, but the MCU's biggest heartstring puller would have never happened. Number 1, what if Iron Man had bombed? Despite being 23 movies deep, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has never once had a major financial disappointment. Everything they make, regardless of how well it's received critically, delivers at the box office, meaning they're willing to try their hand at, well, anything. But can you imagine how improbable that would have seemed in the build-up to Iron Man's release? A new and unproven studio sinking $150 million into their first ever feature, directed by the guy who had just seen Zathura flop, headlined by a star that was still trying to rehabilitate his reputation in the industry after some highly publicized personal issues, based on a B-level comic book character that a lot of general audiences probably hadn't even heard of. What could possibly go wrong? Well, the answer back then was everything, but in hindsight, nothing. However, if it had, there would have been no MCU. Sequels would never have been greenlit, Disney wouldn't have waded in and thrown incredible sums of money at it, and Sam would never have told Cap he was on his left. So there you have it, those are 10 huge what-ifs that could have changed the MCU forever. Let us know what you made of it all in the comments below, and of course don't forget to like, share and subscribe. In the meantime though, thank you so much for watching. I have of course been Adam Cleary, the human what-if, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.